Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening. I hope you're having a wonderful Tuesday night. Dr. Randall Gates, board certified chiropractic neurologist, also a chiropractic physician at Gates Brain Health. Tonight I'm talking about mold toxicity and neurological autoimmunity and the question of this. So let me go to the presentation and we'll present from beginning. And here we go. For those of you on Facebook, you can watch this on YouTube Live with the PowerPoint screen. Okay, so mold and neurological autoimmunity. What is the story? I'll go through cautions on all or none types of thinking and the testing that you can do to further look into this. In essence, the story behind mold illness is that there are individuals working in basically mold-infested buildings, reporting that they were not feeling well and having a variety of symptoms that were beyond just respiratory problems or allergic rhinitis problems, meaning like hay fever type reactions. And so that started into a great investigation. I'll show you an article here in a second by one group led by Dr. Gray and another important researcher in the functional world, Dr. Risto Vajdani, was involved in the groundwork, so to speak, of mold toxicity as it relates to chronic neurological problems and autoimmune problems. As with anything, there was going to be some pushback because it became a medical legal issue. Meaning you have people who are reporting that they're getting sick from a building where they're working, and so they may be claiming that there's some liability, and of course the people who probably own the building may dispute that liability. So it's a very, very contentious topic, and that's how it started. As time has gone on, we have groups of doctors, largely alternative doctors, who are now saying that most chronic illnesses have some basis in mold exposure, or most likely. And that flies in the face of conventional toxicology, where they're going to say, there's really no definitive evidence. They're going to be aligned with the CDC, who says, in essence, mold can cause, as I mentioned before, respiratory problems, maybe asthma, maybe allergic rhinitis symptoms, but nothing more than that. So what is the real story? And hopefully, as I go through this entire broadcast, you'll have some semblance of an understanding of what the literature is showing right now, where the gaps are, where more research needs to be done, but at least you'll be abreast of the newest information. So again, I would caution you on all or none thinking. In my experience and over 10 years of practice and seeing a lot of people, I don't think there's just one thing that causes most chronic illnesses. I don't think that all chronic illness is due to Lyme disease. I don't think that all chronic illness is due to mold toxicity. I don't think that all chronic illness is due to Hashimoto's thyroiditis, nor do I think that all chronic illness is due to heavy metal toxicity. I think that each of these may have a part, and you have to look at the individual and their case history to say, okay, well, yeah, maybe you were hiking in the woods and then you developed a flu-like illness in the summertime, and ever since then you've had horrible joint pains. Even though you didn't have a rash, maybe that is suggestive of Lyme disease, for example. Or you were perfectly healthy and then you were exposed to this water-damaged house, and all of a sudden you have vestibular migraines and you're dizzy and your feet are numb. Well, that's conspicuous. But just to say, I have chronic fatigue and it must be mold because this doctor online says that all chronic fatigue is due to mold exposure, I think that's where you maybe want to start questioning a little bit more, but it's up to you. I'm just giving you my opinion. And then I'll talk about the testing that can be done later on. So this article right here, you can see, is the one presented by Dr. Gray. This is from 2003. The title is Mixed Mold Mycotoxicosis, Immunological Changes in Humans, following exposure in water-damaged buildings. And you see down here, Aristo Vajdani, he had immunosciences labs at that point. There's some discussion in the alternative world as to maybe that Dr. Vajdani was discovering a lot of association between mold and chronic health problems, and that was maybe an issue for those who were trying to dispute what he was saying. Dr. Vajdani is a well-renowned immunologist. I believe he was at UCLA. He has since started Cyrex Labs, which I'll talk about later. But he is a bright gentleman and pretty well regarded in the functional world. So anyways, down here you can see where my mouse cursor is. What they found, and I forget the sample size of, it's a total of 209 adults that they looked at. And they saw abnormally high levels of anti-nuclear antibodies, anti-smooth muscle antibodies, and CNS myelin antibodies, as well as peripheral nervous system myelin antibodies. So they found all these antibodies to generalized tissues like the anti-nuclear antibody. You see that with lupus, but you see it with almost every autoimmune condition. They saw smooth muscle antibodies, which you may see with like something like autoimmune hepatitis, but other autoimmune conditions. And then they saw all of these central and peripheral nervous system antibodies. So this is 2003, so that's significant. So this may be helping to explain why individuals working or living in water damaged buildings were having symptoms. And then this article, I believe, is out of Finland, and this is a cool study. For those of you in the mold world, you probably want to look at this author, Tamara Tuominen. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing her name, but she is really active in putting out really great research. Here, she was looking at 90 nurses and midwives exposed to dampness microbiota, so basically mold, in a Helsinki obstetric hospital. And then they had a control group of 45 people. So 90 nurses and midwives who were exposed to the mold, and they have a control group of 45 people. They saw that respiratory symptoms were more common, basically 80% versus 29%. So when I'm saying these percentages, basically the first percentage is the nurses and midwives exposed to mold. The second percentage are the control group. So that's not uncommon. You'd expect that to happen. I even had an incident where I had a plant by my bed and I was watering it and I didn't realize that mold was growing underneath it because I was overwatering it, and lo and behold, I developed some really severe respiratory symptoms until I realized what I was doing. And got rid of the plant and the dresser it was sitting on top of. But anyways, respiratory symptoms are what we'd expect. But she went on to show that central or peripheral nervous system symptoms were also more common, 81% versus 11%. So that's pretty significant. Fatigue was more common, 77% versus 24%. Multiple chemical sensitivity, 40% versus 9%. And the so-called brain fog was prevalent, 62 versus 11%. Also arrhythmias, 57 versus 2.4%. So really significant statistics that these nurses and midwives working in this mold-infested hospital, they're having a lot of symptoms aside from respiratory symptoms. So that's something to pay attention to. Here's another article by Dr. Tuominen from Finland. And she reports on two cohorts, so to speak. One is a 9-member family and their pets who are living in a mold-infested house. And then she also reports on another cohort of 30 teachers and 50 students. So about 80 people from a mold-infested school. So remember that one, because I'm going to show you a statistic that's pretty concerning here in a second. She mentioned that all family members in that first cohort ultimately developing a multiple chemical syndrome. In the second cohort, we detected a greatly elevated prevalence of autoimmune conditions and malignancies. And in the second cohort, they found that 36.6% of the teachers suffered from autoimmune conditions, whereas in the general population, the prevalence is much lower, approximately 5 to 8%, depending on which sources used. The incidence of cancer was also alarmingly high. So this is a really nice article to look at. I believe it's open access. So if you want, go look at that video I did on how to research like a professional. You can find this on PubMed. Some very interesting statistics, and she actually lays out the health conditions of a number of these people in the second cohort of the 80 individuals, 30 teachers, 50 students. And there's a lot of autoimmunity in there. So that's important. What is someone from the other side going to say? They're going to say, well, there wasn't a great control group. This is not a randomized controlled trial. We need more of these in order to say that there's scientific evidence of mold toxicity being associated with neurological autoimmunity. That's what they're going to say. What we have to realize is that we're really kind of still in the early stages of researching mold illness as it pertains, or let me say mold toxicity as it pertains to autoimmunity and neurological autoimmunity. And hopefully with time we'll get more and more studies. But these studies are important for you to know about because there is something going on, in my opinion. There's something. I'm not saying it's everything. I'm saying there's something. Okay. And also Dr. Tumanen in this article mentions here how there can be this exposure to the mold toxins and a person can recover, and then it seems that they're re-exposed, and then that can really exacerbate their illness and keep things going. Now here, another article by Dr. Tumanen. I found this to be interesting because she talks here about POTS. POTS stands for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. These are typically young females who are very fatigued. They have brain fog, they have headaches, they may have dizziness, they have anxiety, and because of that, they're commonly labeled as being hysterical or just having anxiety. And oftentimes they're told to go home, and the diagnosis is missed until they see several doctors, and then ultimately the diagnosis of POTS may come up. Thankfully, to the Mayo Clinic, they've done a ton of research on POTS in the last 10 years, and we now know that upwards of 89% of POTS patients have an autoimmune condition where their immune system attacks adrenaline receptors. About 53% have an autoimmune condition against acetylcholine receptors. What does that mean to you? You can go back and watch my POTS and autoimmunity part 2 broadcast. But in essence, when you stand up, you have to send neurological signals down through your autonomic nervous system, which then coordinates getting blood back up to your heart so the blood can go to your brain so you don't pass out. And when that communication is interfered with by antibodies blocking acetylcholine and your autonomic nervous system or adrenaline receptors throughout your autonomic nervous system or your heart, then that whole system doesn't work right. We end up secreting tons of adrenaline, which then causes tachycardia, which causes people to feel fatigued and have more brain fog, more anxiety, etc., etc. So you can go ahead and watch my POTS broadcast. But nonetheless, Dr. Tumanen talks about POTS being seen with those exposed to mold. So here she goes on to say that both POTS and ME/CFS, that's myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome, were found common in children and youngsters exposed to indoor, this is dampness microbiota, at schools and or homes, occurring in 49 out of 81 and 56 out of 81 of respondents, respectively. So I believe this was a study where they basically did a questionnaire, but they found that POTS was really common, or chronic fatigue were really common, in those exposed to mold. So for all of you POTS patients out there suffering, something to consider. Okay, moving on. Now this is an article out of by Duke University. One researcher is out of Duke University. The other researchers are at a toxicology and industrial health clinic where they work with a lot of people who have chemical sensitivity. And this is important for anyone who's really trying to figure out, okay, what antibodies to run, what neurological tissues are being affected. What they found was that those who are exposed to contaminated water or mold, water damaged buildings, I believe all 8 of these subjects from the mold group were female, pesticides and chemicals, they found compared to controls that neurofilament protein, MAP2, tau protein antibodies, myelin basic protein antibodies, GFAP, this is glial fibrillary acidic protein antibodies, tubulin, and S100B or S100 beta antibodies were high in all of these groups compared to controls. And the mold group was particularly high, if I remember right, in tau antibodies. Tau is a cytoskeletal structural protein. It's involved with the microtubules. As I mentioned in the concussion and chronic traumatic encephalopathy broadcast, tau is kind of like it's kind of like let me say it this way. You have like 2x4s within your neurons, and then you have little things that go back and forth, trafficking proteins. And so when tau becomes abnormally folded, that type of transportation does not work well. So this is significant because if you've been exposed to a moldy environment, and then you developed neurological symptoms, you may want to show this article to your toxicologist because it is published by an author from Duke University, and they have some convincing evidence here. Is it perfect? No. Do they need to do more research with better control groups? Probably. But from an observational study perspective, I think it's pretty interesting. The toxins that are tested by Great Plains Laboratory are these ones: aflatoxin, ochratoxin A. I think I missed an H there, sorry. Ochratoxin A, gliotoxin, all these other toxins, mycophenolic acid, Oridin E, rucarin A, and then these other toxins. Big long names. And then in terms of autoimmune testing, the Mayo Clinic has great autoimmune testing for neurological autoimmunity. Even Quest Labs, I like their neurological autoimmunity testing. Cyrix Labs has a lot of good assays as well. You're going to hear about other tests. One is out of the Bay Area. And I don't know, anytime you test positive for neurological autoimmunity, just make sure that you try to substantiate it with something like the Mayo Clinic Quest or Cyrix Labs. That's all I'll say in my experience. And then mold remediation, I put that this is a tough issue. The problem with this, in my experience, is that once you start reading on mold forums, you're going to read a lot of information where people are basically going to say, you have to completely change your life, you have to move far away, you have to throw away all of your clothes. And I've seen patients do that, and I've seen patients get better. I've also seen patients maybe go to really great lengths to get rid of potentially mold-infested clothes or other things, and it can be pretty consuming. So that's my only caution. I'm not questioning those individuals. I'm just saying my heart goes out to those who believe that mold is causing their problem, and it can be a significant emotional strain for them and their family. So I think getting out of a moldy environment, if someone is continuously being exposed, at least for a period of time until that environment can be remediated, may be a good thing. Another argument, though, is that mold is ubiquitous. So mold is everywhere. And some people are totally fine being around mold, and other people seem to have issues. So you may want to look into how your liver is getting rid of mold toxins, because that can be an important feature. And I know I'm probably going to get a lot of blowback on this, but there's no one right solution. I think each situation has to be handled individually. And if you're finding mold toxins in your house, you may want to call a remediation company and see what they can do, or having ducting cleaned and things like that. when are the toxins gone? It's hard to say because mold is literally everywhere. So, approaching it from a balanced perspective, I think is the best thing I can recommend. Getting rid of the mold if you can, great. Getting rid of the toxins if you can, great. Helping your liver to get rid of toxins, fantastic. But also I urge you to keep in mind that mold is also everywhere. And then in terms of treatment, what we do at Gates Brain Health is really a balanced approach to mold toxicity. That's how I term it. A lot of doctors you're going to read about who focus on what's called CIRS. I think it's called the chronic inflammatory response syndrome secondary to mold. They may be a little farther on the spectrum of measures you need to go to get out of the moldy environment. I try to create a treatment that's doable and without extremely significant measures that may cause someone to move to Antarctica, for example, where there's no mold, potentially. So that's my take. Give us a call if you have any questions. I hope this was helpful. I came on late because I wanted to attach all those articles to show you that there is evidence. There seems to be something with significant mold exposures and chronic neurological autoimmune issues. Can we say unequivocally that that is the case? I wouldn't say that yet, but it does seem that there's mounting evidence that there may be a link. So that's it. And I will be back soon with another broadcast. Okay. Let me see here.